The bet that changed everything. The city was alive, its neon lights reflecting against the rain-slicked streets below. Damien Scott, a self-made millionaire, leaned back in his leather armchair, the skyline of his empire stretching out before him. The faint clink of ice against his whiskey glass was the only sound in his luxurious penthouse as his longtime friend, Ryan, leaned forward with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Let's make things interesting," Ryan said, a grin spreading across his face. Damien raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Ryan continued, his voice laced with challenge. "I bet you wouldn't dare marry someone completely different from the women you're used to. Someone who doesn't fit your mold." Damien chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Different how?" he asked, though his tone was more curious than dismissive. "Someone who doesn't look like your usual arm candy," Ryan replied, leaning back smugly. "Let's say, a black woman. Not a model, not dripping in wealth or status. Just someone real." Damien's smile widened, his confidence unshaken. "And the stakes?" Ryan smirked. $500,000, 6 months of marriage, and you win. But here's the catch. She has to be the kind of woman who wouldn't normally give you the time of day. Think you can handle it? Damien didn't hesitate. He lived for challenges, thrived on proving people wrong. "You're on," he said, raising his glass to seal the deal. Days later, Damien met Zara Thompson. She was a fiercely independent woman, with a no-nonsense attitude and an aura of quiet strength. Her caramel brown eyes met his with unwavering confidence, and her natural curls framed a face that didn't flinch under his scrutinizing gaze. Unlike the women who usually vied for his attention, Zara wasn't impressed by the glitz or glamour. "I know why I'm here," Zara said flatly as she took her seat across from Damien at a high-end restaurant. Her tone was calm but firm, carrying an authority that immediately unsettled him. "I know about your bet." Damien blinked, his usual suave demeanor faltering. "You? No. I'm not stupid, Damien," she replied, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Men like you think the world revolves around your whims. But let me make one thing clear. I'm not here to play along with your little game. I have my reasons for agreeing to this, but don't mistake my compliance for submission." For the first time in years, Damien felt outmaneuvered. He was used to being the one in control, the one dictating the rules. Yet here she was, unshaken and unapologetic. "And yet you agreed," Damien countered, his voice carrying a trace of curiosity. "Why?" Zara's eyes held his. "Let's just say I see an opportunity here, but don't expect me to change or fall in line. 6 months, Damien. That's all you're getting." The initial weeks of their arrangement were tense. Damien spared no expense in trying to impress Zara. Lavish dinners, designer clothes, exotic weekend getaways. But none of it seemed to faze her. "I don't need any of this," Zara said one evening as they sat in the back of a chauffeured car. "Money doesn't impress me, Damien. It never has." Her words irritated him more than he cared to admit. He was used to women who melted under the weight of his wealth, who saw his lifestyle as the ultimate prize. But Zara wasn't playing by those rules. In fact, she wasn't playing at all. Determined to assert control, Damien began to impose himself on Zara's life. He disrupted her work schedule, ensuring she had to cancel important commitments, and micromanaged her days under the guise of maintaining appearances for their public arrangement. Yet every time he tried to corner her, she pushed back with an unyielding resolve. "I'm not your puppet, Damien," she said one evening after another one of his calculated moves. "You may have money, but that doesn't give you the right to dictate my life." Her words stung, though Damien masked it with his trademark smirk. He couldn't admit it yet, but Zara was challenging more than just his ego. She was making him question the very foundation of his power, the privilege he had always taken for granted. One rainy afternoon, Zara suggested they meet at a modest cafe, far removed from Damien's usual high-end haunts. The warm aroma of coffee filled the air as Damien walked in, visibly out of place in his tailored suit amidst the casual patrons. Zara was already seated, sipping her coffee with a serene expression. "You look uncomfortable," she teased as he sat across from her. "Not my usual scene," he admitted, glancing around. "Maybe it should be," she said, her tone lighter than usual. They talked, and for the first time, it wasn't about the arrangement or the terms of their deal. Zara shared stories about her work in social justice, about the struggles she had faced as a black woman navigating a world that often tried to diminish her voice. Damien listened, genuinely intrigued. For the first time, he found himself wanting to understand her rather than control her. Weeks turned into months, and Damien began to notice something he couldn't ignore. Zara wasn't just different because of her background or her appearance. She was different because she saw the world in a way he never had. She cared deeply about others, about fairness and justice, and she didn't let his wealth intimidate her or distract her from her purpose. One night, after an extravagant party at his penthouse where Zara had stolen the show, not with glitz but with her authenticity, Damien found himself alone, staring out at the city. For the first time, the skyline didn't give him the rush of power he was used to. Instead, it felt hollow. Zara had changed something in him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it yet. It wasn't about winning anymore. It wasn't about the bet. It was about her. Damien Scott sat alone in his penthouse, the sprawling city below feeling less like an empire and more like a labyrinth. The lights shimmered in the distance, but they didn't bring the comfort they once did. His mind was clouded with Zara. Her words, her defiance, her unwavering self-respect. The bet had been a joke at first, a game to stoke his ego. But now it felt like the punchline was on him. The extravagant party earlier that evening still lingered in his mind. Zara, with her quiet confidence and authentic charm, had captivated everyone. Damien's plan to display her as a trophy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of being overshadowed by his wealth, Zara had become the center of attention, not because of her connection to him, but because of who she was. And then Ryan, his so-called friend, had ruined everything. The careless mention of the bet had pierced through Zara's composed exterior. Damien could still see the flash of hurt in her eyes before she walked out, leaving him to stew in his own shame. The next morning, Damien woke to an unfamiliar feeling: regret. Zara was gone, her side of the penthouse eerily quiet. Her things were still there, but it felt like her presence had been drained from the space. For a man who had always been in control, Damien now felt utterly powerless. He spent the day pacing the penthouse, replaying every conversation, every misstep. His attempts to control Zara had been about more than winning the bet. They had been about protecting the carefully constructed image he had of himself. But Zara had torn that image apart, forcing him to confront the flaws he had buried under layers of arrogance. Finally, Damien decided he couldn't let things end this way. For once in his life, he was willing to risk his pride. He had to see Zara, to talk to her, not as the arrogant millionaire who thought he could buy her compliance, but as a man trying to understand the depth of his mistakes. When Damien showed up at the community center where Zara worked, he was uncharacteristically nervous. The building was modest, a far cry from the towering skyscrapers he was used to, but there was an energy here that felt alive. Damien stepped inside, the hum of conversations and laughter hitting him like a wave. He spotted Zara in the corner, speaking with a group of young people. She was animated, her hands moving as she explained something, her passion lighting up the room. Damien hesitated. He had never seen her like this, so fully in her element, so vibrant. It struck him how little he really knew about her. When Zara finally noticed him, her expression was unreadable. She excused herself from the group and approached him, her arms crossed. "What are you doing here, Damien?" she asked, her tone measured but cool. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "To apologize." Zara raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Apologize for what exactly? For making me the subject of a bet? For trying to control me? Or for underestimating me in every possible way?" Her words hit like a series of punches, each one deserved. Damien took a deep breath. For all of it, he admitted, I was wrong, Zara, about everything. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether his words held any truth. Finally, she spoke. Why now? Why not just cut your losses and move on? Isn't that what someone like you would usually do? Damien sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because I can't move on. Not like this. You've shown me things about myself that I didn't want to see. And it's not just about the bet anymore. It's about you. Zara's expression softened, but only slightly. Words are easy, Damien. Actions are harder. If you're serious about this, then prove it. The next few weeks were unlike anything Damien had experienced. For the first time in his life, he stepped out of his world of luxury and privilege to immerse himself in Zara's. He attended events at the community center, not as a guest of honor, but as a volunteer. He helped organize fundraisers, participated in workshops, and listened to stories from people whose lives were worlds apart from his own. At first, it was awkward. Damien was used to commanding boardrooms, not blending into community events. But as time went on, he began to see the value in what Zara was doing. Her work wasn't about recognition or profit. It was about people, real people with real struggles. And for the first time, Damien started to understand the weight of the privilege he had always taken for granted. One evening, after a particularly long day of the center, Damien and Zara sat together on a bench outside. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. Damien turned to Zara, his expression serious. I never realized how small my world was, he admitted. I thought money and power were everything. But now I see how empty they are without purpose. You've taught me that, Zara, and I'm grateful. Zara looked at him, her expression unreadable. Gratitude is nice, Damien, but it's not enough. If you really want to change, it has to be for you, not for me. Her words stayed with him long after she left that night. Damien realized she was right. The changes he was making couldn't be about winning Zara's approval. They had to come from a genuine desire to be a better person. Over the next few months, Damien threw himself into self-reflection and growth. He sought out mentors who could help him understand issues of race, privilege, and social justice. He read books, attended seminars, and had difficult conversations with people whose experiences were vastly different from his own. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Zara watched his transformation from a distance, cautious but intrigued. She saw the sincerity in his efforts, the way he was beginning to shed the arrogance that had once defined him. And slowly, she began to let her guard down. By the time their 6-month arrangement came to an end, Damien was no longer the man who had entered into the bet. He stood before Zara, not as a millionaire trying to win a game, but as a man humbled by the lessons she had taught him. I don't care about the bet anymore, Damien said. I care about you, but I also know that I have a lot more work to do, and I don't expect you to wait for me. I just want you to know that you've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to explain. Zara smiled, her first genuine smile toward him in months. Keep doing the work, Damien. Not for me, but for yourself. And maybe, just maybe, we'll see where this goes. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a beginning. One built on mutual respect, understanding, and the possibility of something real. The months following their arrangement were like stepping into uncharted territory for Damien Scott. The 6-month marriage was officially over, but Zara Thompson lingered in his thoughts and heart. Their parting was amicable, yet it carried an air of unfinished business. Damien was left with a truth that humbled him. For the first time in his life, someone had seen through his armor of wealth and power, and refused to be blinded by it. Now, standing in his penthouse, Damien looked out over the city that once symbolized his success. It no longer felt like the center of the universe. The towering skyscrapers were nothing more than empty monuments to his former self. He'd been admired, envied, even feared, but never truly understood. Zara had changed that. She'd made him question not only who he was, but who he wanted to be. And for the first time in his life, Damien wanted more than just success. He wanted purpose. Determined to continue his transformation, Damien threw himself into Zora's world. While the superficial part of him itched to throw money at the causes she cared about, he knew better now. Zora's voice echoed in his mind. Change isn't about writing a check, Damien. It's about showing up. It's about doing the work. He started small, attending community meetings and volunteering at the center where Zora worked. At first, he was met with suspicion. People saw him as an outsider, a wealthy man playing at charity. But Damien was patient. He didn't try to take over or impose his ideas. He listened. He learned. He stayed late to stack chairs and clean floors, proving with actions what words could never convey. One evening, an older man named Harold, a longtime community member, approached Damien after a meeting. "You keep showing up," Harold said, his weathered face etched with curiosity. "What's your angle, son?" "No angle," Damien replied honestly. I want to do better." Harold studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's rare to see a man admit he's got things to learn. Keep at it, and you just might surprise us." Meanwhile, Zora had moved on, or so she thought. She continued her work in social justice, pouring her energy into initiatives that empowered marginalized communities. She told herself she didn't have time to think about Damien. But late at night, when the world was quiet, memories of him crept in. The way he'd listened intently when she spoke, the effort he'd made to understand her world. It was hard to reconcile the arrogant man she'd met with the person he was becoming. Their paths crossed occasionally, often at community events where Damien's presence had become a quiet constant. At first, Zora kept her distance, unsure of his motives. But as the weeks turned into months, she couldn't ignore the change in him. He wasn't there to be seen or to gain approval. He was there because he cared. One afternoon, Zora was preparing for a workshop on racial equity when Damien walked into the community center carrying a stack of supplies. She raised an eyebrow as he set the boxes down. "Didn't expect to see you here today," she said. "I heard you needed these," Damien replied, motioning to the materials. "Figured I'd help out." Zora studied him, her skepticism softening into something resembling gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her tone measured but sincere. They worked side by side to set up the room, the silence between them companionable. Damien couldn't help but steal glances at Zora as she moved with purpose, her passion evident in everything she did. Finally, he spoke. "I admire you, Zora," he said, his voice steady. "Not just for what you do, but for who you are." Zora paused, her hands resting on a stack of papers. "What are you saying, Damien?" "I'm saying I'm grateful," he replied. "You opened my eyes to things I never saw before, and not just about the world, about myself. I'm trying to be better, and a lot of that is because of you." Zora met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It's not my job to fix you, Damien," she said softly. "You have to want it for yourself." "I know," Damien said. "And I do. But that doesn't change the fact that you've inspired me." Over the next few months, their interactions became more frequent, though neither dared to label what was happening between them. They worked together on projects, often finding themselves in long conversations about life, justice, and the complexities of the world. Damien found himself drawn not just to Zora's strength, but to her vulnerability. The moments when her guard slipped, revealing the woman behind the armor. One evening, after a particularly emotional workshop, Zora and Damien found themselves walking together through the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The air was crisp, and the faint hum of city life surrounded them. "You've changed, Damien," Zora said, her voice thoughtful. "I didn't think it was possible, but you've proved me wrong." "I had a good teacher," he replied with a small smile. They stopped at a park bench, the glow of a nearby street lamp casting soft shadows. Zora looked at Damien, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "What do you want, Damien?" she asked. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I want to keep growing, to keep learning, And I want to see where this goes. Us. Zora's eyes searched his, looking for any trace of the man who had once made her a pawn in his game. She found none. What she saw instead was a man who was willing to admit his flaws, to confront his privilege, and to do the hard work of change. I don't need promises or grand gestures, Zora said finally. What I need is consistency. Show me you mean it, not with words, but with actions. Damien nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I will, he said. Every day, for as long as it takes. The journey ahead was uncertain, but it was one they were willing to take together. For Damien, it wasn't about proving himself to Zara anymore. It was about becoming the man he had always pretended to be. And for Zara, it was about trusting that people could change, not because they were forced to, but because they truly wanted to. In the end, their story wasn't about a bet or a challenge. It was about redemption, growth, and the power of seeing someone, not for who they are, but for who they could become. The winter months were harsh, but Damien Scott no longer noticed the chill in the air. The penthouse he once called his fortress of power had become a place of quiet reflection. Filled with books he'd never thought he'd read and reminders of the life he was slowly leaving behind. The Damien of 6 months ago would have scoffed at the man he was becoming. Someone who traded boardroom battles for community meetings. Someone who found joy in humility instead of control. Yet, for all the change he had undergone, one thing remained constant. Zara Thompson. Her presence in his life, whether distant or near, was like the North Star, guiding him even when he felt lost. Their budding connection had grown more complex over time, no longer defined by the bet that brought them together, but by the quiet respect and understanding that had replaced it. One evening, as Damien prepared to leave the penthouse for a small community event, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Zara. Need an extra pair of hands at the center. Can you come by early? Damien smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected. Zara rarely asked for help, which made every request feel significant. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the sharp winter air biting at his face as he walked the now familiar route to the community center. When he arrived, the scene was chaotic. Volunteers scurried around, carrying boxes of supplies, setting up tables, and decorating the modest space for what looked like a larger event than usual. In the middle of it all was Zora, clipboard in hand, giving instructions with her usual poise. You look like you've got this under control, Damien teased as he approached her. Zara turned, a small smirk playing on her lips. I do, but even I can't carry everything by myself. Think you can manage a few boxes without breaking a sweat? Challenge accepted, Damien replied, rolling up his sleeves. As the evening unfolded, Damien found himself working harder than he had in years. Not physically, but emotionally. He engaged with volunteers, listened to their stories, and helped create a space that felt welcoming and warm. The event was a community dinner, a chance for people from all walks of life to come together, share a meal, and connect. By the time the guests began arriving, the room was filled with the hum of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of plates. Damien stood by Zora's side as they watched the scene unfold, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. You did this, he said softly. Zara shook her head. We did this. And not just tonight. This community has been building something for years. I'm just lucky to be a part of it. Her humility struck him once again. Damien had spent most of his life taking credit for every success, but Zara's approach was different. She uplifted those around her, shining a light on their contributions rather than her own. It was one of the many things he admired about her. As the night wound down and the last of the guests filtered out, Damien and Zara stayed behind to help clean up. The quiet of the nearly empty room was a stark contrast to the earlier chaos, and Damien found himself stealing glances at Zara as she worked. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was a lightness about her, a sense of purpose that made her seem untouchable, yet deeply human at the same time. Finally, as they carried the last of the supplies to the storage room, Damien couldn't hold back any longer. "Zara," he began, his voice hesitant but sincere. "Can we talk?" She turned to him, her expression guarded but curious. "About what?" "About us," he said. "I know I've said this before, but I need you to hear me out. I care about you, and I don't mean in some shallow, fleeting way. I mean, I see you, for who you are, for what you stand for, and I want to be a part of that, not to take anything away from you, but to add to it." Zara's gaze softened, but her posture remained firm. "Damien, I don't need someone to complete me. I need someone who can walk beside me. Someone who understands that this life, my life, isn't glamorous or easy. It's messy, it's exhausting, and it's not for everyone." "I know," Damien said, "and I don't expect it to be easy, but I'm willing to try, to show up, to learn, to support you in whatever way I can. Not because I want to prove something, but because I want to be better. With you, not just for you." Zara studied him for a long moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Finally, she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Then show me, Damien. Not with words, but with actions. If you can do that, we'll see where this goes." The weeks that followed were a test of Damien's resolve. He continued to immerse himself in Zara's world, not just as a supporter, but as a partner. He learned how to listen without trying to fix everything, how to offer help without overshadowing, and how to navigate the delicate balance of being present without overstepping. Zara, in turn, began to let her guard down. She invited Damien into the parts of her life she had always kept private. Her fears, her hopes, her dreams. They shared long conversations over cups of tea, talked about their vastly different upbringings, and discovered common ground in the values they held dear. One particularly cold evening, Damien surprised Zara by taking her to a quiet corner of the city where he had rented a small gallery space. Inside were photographs, art pieces, and written testimonials from the community members whose lives Zara had touched through her work. "What is this?" Zara asked, her voice filled with wonder. "It's for you," Damien said, "to honor everything you've done. These stories, these faces, they're a testament to the impact you've made. And I wanted you to see that." Zara walked through the space, her eyes misting as she took in the display. Each piece told a story of resilience, hope, and transformation, and at the center of it all was a plaque that read, "In honor of Zara Thompson, whose unwavering dedication inspires us all." For the first time in a long while, Zara was speechless. She turned to Damien, her expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," Damien replied, "but I wanted to. Because you deserve to be celebrated, Zara. Not just for what you've done, but for who you are." In that moment, Zara saw the depth of Damien's sincerity. He wasn't the man she had met months ago, the man who saw people as pawns in his games. He was someone entirely new, someone she could see herself walking beside. Their journey was far from over, but as they stood together in that gallery, surrounded by the lives they had touched, Zara and Damien knew they were heading in the right direction. For the first time, their story wasn't about power or control. It was about partnership, growth, and the kind of love that transforms not just individuals, but entire worlds. The gallery moment had solidified something between Damien and Zara, a quiet understanding that their connection was no longer defined by obligation or fleeting feelings. It was rooted in respect, growth, and a desire to build something real. But love, especially one born of such unlikely circumstances, wasn't without its trials. For Damien, the transformation he had begun wasn't complete. Every step forward was accompanied by a lingering sense of doubt, whispers of his old self trying to pull him back. Could he really be the man Zara deserved? Could he prove, not only to her but to himself, that this wasn't just another challenge to conquer, but a life he was willing to embrace? For Zara, trusting Damien wasn't easy. Her walls had been built over years of experiencing dismissiveness, condescension, and outright bias from men like him, powerful men who saw the world through lenses of privilege. Damien's efforts were genuine, but they weren't a guarantee. Trust was a fragile thing, and she needed time to let it grow. Winter melted into spring, and with it came the bloom of new beginnings. Damien had taken Zora's words to heart. If their relationship was to work, he needed to prove himself with actions, not promises. And he knew that meant more than showing up at community events or listening intently during their late-night talks. It meant confronting the parts of himself he had long ignored. He began by seeking out experiences that would challenge his perspective. He volunteered for initiatives outside of Zora's immediate world, immersing himself in projects that focused on housing inequality, systemic racism, and education reform. He didn't announce his efforts to Zora or use them to win her approval. Instead, he let his actions speak for themselves, quietly integrating himself into the fabric of a world he had once only observed from a distance. One day, during a fundraiser for a scholarship program aimed at supporting underprivileged students, Damien was approached by a young woman named Tasha. She had been one of the program's first recipients and now worked as a teacher in her old neighborhood. "I've heard about you," Tasha said, her tone both curious and cautious. "You're the rich guy trying to make a difference, huh?" Damien smiled, unoffended by her bluntness. "Trying," he admitted, emphasis on the trying. Tasha studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, we need more people like you, people who don't just throw money at problems, but actually get their hands dirty. Keep it up." Her words stayed with him. They weren't effusive praise, but they were honest, and they reminded Damien that real change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency. Zora, meanwhile, watched Damien's progress from a distance. She had expected his interest in her world to fade, for his efforts to wane once the novelty wore off. But Damien surprised her. He didn't falter. If anything, his commitment deepened. One evening, Zora received a text from a colleague who worked with a local mentorship program. "You won't believe this, but Damien Scott is hosting workshops for our teens. He's actually good at it." Zora laughed softly, shaking her head. The image of Damien, a man who once thrived on cutthroat business deals, mentoring teenagers, felt almost surreal. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. Damien wasn't just trying to change. He was discovering new parts of himself in the process. Their relationship, however, wasn't without its tensions. Damien's past, though no longer a defining part of who he was, still cast long shadows. One afternoon, Zora and Damien were walking through the neighborhood when they ran into one of Zora's old friends, Carmen. Carmen greeted Zora warmly but cast a wary eye at Damien. "So, this is him?" she asked, her tone guarded. Zora nodded. "Yes, this is Damien." Carmen's expression didn't soften. "You sure about this, Zora? Men like him don't change. They play the game, but at the end of the day, they're still the same underneath." Damien felt the sting of her words but remained silent, letting Zora respond. "I hear you, Carmen," Zora said, "but I've seen him change. And I'm not saying it's easy or perfect, but he's not the same man he was." Carmen gave Damien a long, hard look before turning back to Zora. "Just be careful, okay?" The encounter left Damien thoughtful. He couldn't fault Carmen for her skepticism. She wasn't wrong to be protective of Zora. It only reinforced what Damien already knew. Trust wasn't something given. It was earned, over time, and through consistent action. As the months passed, Damien and Zora began to find a rhythm in their relationship. They still had their disagreements. Damien's instinct to fix things sometimes clashed with Zora's need for autonomy, but they learned how to navigate their differences. Damien discovered the power of stepping back, of allowing Zora to lead without feeling the need to assert himself, and Zora found herself softening, allowing Damien into spaces she once kept guarded. One such moment came on a quiet Sunday afternoon. They were at Zora's modest apartment, a space she had refused to leave despite Damien's offers to buy her something larger. "This place is mine," Zara had told him firmly. It's not about the size. It's about what it represents, my independence. That day, as they sat together on her couch, Zara pulled out a photo album. She hesitated before handing it to Damien. I don't show this to many people, she said, but I want you to see it. Damien opened the album to find photographs of Zara's family, her childhood, and the moments that had shaped her. There were pictures of her parents marching in civil rights protests, of Zara as a young girl holding up a homemade sign that read "Equality for All," and of her grandmother, a woman whose fierce eyes mirrored Zara's own. This is why I do what I do, Zara said quietly. It's not just about me. It's about honoring the people who came before me, who fought for a world that didn't see their worth. Damien looked at the photos, his heart heavy with both admiration and a sense of responsibility. Thank you for sharing this with me, he said. I understand now, more than ever, what's at stake for you. And I want you to know, I'm with you. For all of it. The summer brought new challenges, but also new triumphs. Together, Damien and Zara worked to expand the programs of the community center, securing funding that allowed them to launch initiatives for job training, mental health support, and youth mentorship. Their partnership became a symbol of what could happen when two people from vastly different worlds came together with a shared purpose. At the end of a long day, as they stood on the steps of the center watching the sunset, Zara turned to Damien. You've come a long way, she said, her tone thoughtful. So have we, Damien replied, taking her hand. Zara smiled, a warmth spreading through her. Yeah, we have. Their journey wasn't over, but for the first time, they stood on equal footing, partners in every sense of the word, ready to face whatever came next together. The final chapter. The late summer air was warm as Damien and Zara stood outside the community center, watching the last of the volunteers head home. The once bustling building was quiet now, the echoes of laughter and conversation fading into the night. Damien leaned against the railing, looking at Zara with a mix of gratitude and reverence. Do you ever think about how far we've come? Damien asked, his voice low but steady. Zara tilted her head, her lips curling into a thoughtful smile. All the time. But it's not just about how far we've come. It's about what we've learned along the way. Their journey, born out of a cruel and thoughtless bet, had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. What began as a test of arrogance had become a story of growth, redemption, and the power of seeing beyond the surface. Damien's lesson. True change comes from within. For Damien, the greatest lesson was realizing that transformation couldn't be forced or faked. It had to come from within, driven by a desire to be better, not for someone else, but for himself. Zara had challenged everything he believed about power, privilege, and relationships. She had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had buried beneath wealth and ego. But Damien's transformation wasn't about erasing who he had been. It was about acknowledging his flaws, taking responsibility for his actions, and making the conscious choice to grow. He had learned that true strength wasn't in controlling others, but in embracing vulnerability, humility, and the courage to change. In the process, Damien found a purpose beyond the superficial success he had once chased. His work with the community became a cornerstone of his life, not as an act of penance, but as a way to contribute meaningfully to the world around him. Trust takes time and action. Zara, too, had grown. Her walls, carefully constructed over years of hurt and skepticism, had started to come down, not because Damien had broken through them, but because he had earned her trust. She had learned that it was okay to let someone in, even someone from a world so different from her own, as long as they showed a genuine willingness to understand and support her. For Zara, the journey wasn't about changing Damien. It was about standing firm in her values and allowing him to rise to meet her. She had shown him that love wasn't about control or grand gestures. It was about consistency, respect, and partnership. Their partnership, a story of balance. Together, Damien and Zara built a relationship founded on equality. They learned to navigate their differences, using them as opportunities to grow rather than obstacles to overcome. Their bond became a symbol of what could happen when two people, no matter how different their backgrounds, chose to listen, learn, and grow together. Love is transformation. As they stood outside the community center, Zara turned to Damien, her eyes reflecting the streetlights. "Do you ever regret it? The bet, I mean." Damien shook his head, his expression solemn. "I regret how it started. I regret who I was back then. But I don't regret where it led us. You've changed my life, Zara. Not because you fixed me, but because you made me want to be better." Zara smiled softly. "And you've shown me that people can change if they're willing to do the work. But the work never ends, Damien. You know that, right?" "I do," he said, "and I'm ready for it." Hand in hand, they walked into the quiet night, their steps steady and purposeful. Their story wasn't about a bet anymore. It was about two people who defied the odds, who chose growth over comfort and love over fear. It was a reminder that transformation, though difficult, was possible, and that sometimes the most unexpected paths could lead to the most profound destinations. The takeaway: the story of Damien and Zara teaches us that growth requires humility, effort, and time. It reminds us that true love isn't about changing someone, but about inspiring them to become the best version of themselves. It challenges us to confront our own biases, to embrace vulnerability, and to build relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. Ultimately, it's a story about redemption, not just for Damien, but for anyone willing to do the hard work of becoming better, kinder, and more aware. It's a testament to the power of connection and the belief that, no matter where we come from, we can all find common ground if we're willing to look beyond the surface. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.